Transformation seminar. We're very pleased to have Dr. Shaheed Tayob, who has joined our department, and so this is also a great event to celebrate his arrival in the department. First of all, Dr. Tayob did a PhD at University of Utrecht with the title Islam as a Lived Tradition, Ethical Constellations of Muslim Food Practices in Mumbai. And he's also written on a variety of other topics, including looking at the World Cup in 2010 as a millennial capitalist moment, and written a review of Muslim networks from Hajj to Hip Hop, which I'd like to read. And we're very pleased to have you speak today. And the title, do you want to introduce the title?
Okay, what is the title? Okay, Halal consumption is an ethical practice, negotiating the emerging terrain of certification in South Africa. Halal.
Thanks, and we will go for the usual format, which is about 40 minutes presentation, and then the rest of the time for discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so thanks so much for taking the time to come and also giving the opportunity to present. Okay, so this is a kind of a paper that I just recently written. You've basically seen a bit of the abstract. We had to cut it down quite a bit. And also the last sentence was cut off. But basically, a research it comes out of research that I done in South Africa on halal certification. And basically, the changes, halal certification is introducing a new kind of basically material and discursive practice of halal. Right? So halal is a Muslim food practice. It has a long history. It has it basically refers to food that Muslims consider permissible to eat. Halal specifically refers to the ritual of slaughter, whereby an animal is rendered into permissible meat. But in recent decades, a global development has emerged called halal certification. So this is an idea that basically halal can be assured by the inspection of a certificate. And so my work is basically on halal certification, on the transformation that it brings about, how people basically negotiate this kind of new terrain of halal. So what I'm going to do is I'll start by giving you an overview of what halal is and how how halal was practiced before certification. Then I'll introduce you to halal certification and the mechanisms and the theories through which they establish a new terrain of expertise. And and then after that, I'll get down to actually the question of ethics, or what I'm trying to deal with here, looking at individual narratives and the way that people basically negotiate as well, and also the kind of prevailing arguments in where I'm trying to situate myself. So halal, as I said, okay, so it means permissible. It's basically food that has been slaughtered in a particular way. It refers, so it's a method of slaughter. It transfers an animal into halal meat, into permissible meat. The thing with halal, pre-certification practice of halal, is that with meat consumption, the consumer is usually not the supplier or the producer. Right? And this is not something new. This is basically, you go to the shop, the butcher, somebody else is often the person who's slaughtering. So there is a very peculiar notion of trust embedded into the practice of halal. And the way that this is articulated or understood and has been practiced is that supply of halal by a fellow Muslim constitutes trust. In the event that the supplier knowingly deceived you about that supply, so you consume something and somebody has given it to you and they knowingly knew that this was not halal but they gave it to you anyway, the sin for that transgression accrues to the supplier. If both people unknowingly consume, so if this is completely unknown to both people, and both the supplier and the consumer were unaware of this, then neither of them bear any kind of sin. So built into the way that trust in halal is established is an idea of intention, that is niyyat. The discourse is a kind of a discourse on niyyat. And that is that the unintentional transgression of halal does not accrue sin. It only in the context of intentional actions. And this is a broader kind of discussion which I also dealing with more in the rest in my thesis and things, is about how we think about the relation between practice and the fulfillment of practice. Right? So this is it's related to yeah, it's a broad discussion, but essentially what happens is what this kind of idea about this particular idea of trust that's embedded in this notion of halal, it basically means that halal is secured through intra-Muslim networks of trade. It means that as long as you are dealing with another Muslim, that therefore establishes that this thing is halal. Furthermore, it is considered frowned upon to doubt another Muslim. So given the availability of visible signs of Muslimness, halal is established. It is considered frowned upon, a kind of a sin. I mean, these are ideas that are basically articulated in different ways, and an offense to basically go to somebody else and to question their halal status, based on the fact that they are Muslim, but also, and especially in familiar, family, friend contexts. It's not because of the way that this because of the way that this trust is established. So what happens is, so in South Africa, for example, when halal first started out, like as a kind of the first organization, unfortunately I couldn't get this, but it's fine. I think the first organization to establish a kind of a halal, they didn't call it certification, they called it halal assurance or something like that. But basically they were in 1958 with the Muslim Judicial Council in Cape Town. And the Muslim butchers approached the Muslim Judicial Council, who was an ulama organization of religious leaders, for kind of theological backing for these practices that the butchers were anyway doing. They wanted some guidance on some specific issues that they were encountering in the municipal abattoirs. Now at that point, how halal used to work was, Muslims had, I think it was either once or twice a week, I can't remember now, but they had, I think it was twice a week, so it's like a Tuesday or Thursday. They basically had a few hours in the abattoir where the place would be cleaned, Muslims would be able to come there, they would slaughter themselves, and they would distribute to their own stores. So there was a network of Muslim butchers all over Cape Town where basically would receive halal. There was something called a membership certificate. So if you were a member of the Muslim Butchers Association, then you weren't necessarily meant, you put that certificate there, it showed you it's a membership certificate, not a certification certificate. There's a slight difference. It meant that, okay, fine, you have now received all your meat through our arrangement with the municipality and the state, and basically that's how halal was established. So at this point, even though you're having a kind of a minority Muslim community, you're having basically changes from maybe in a kind of organized urban setting, you still have a kind of an intra-Muslim networks of trade which established this question of halal. This basically carries on in South Africa for about at least 20 years. So the first murmurings of a change that's taking place happened first in South Africa, and I think the case was in 1984. And this is basically signals the start of halal certification, right? Now the issue that basically brought this up, there were two issues. The one was, and it happened around the same time in the 80s. The one was the awareness by the halal organization, that is the MJC, came to their attention that margarine may not be halal because margarine uses gelatin. So basically the people, even though people had been eating margarine and it had become increasingly a common product, somehow it came to their attention that margarine contains, actually they're making it with gelatin, and gelatin could potentially be coming from non-halal sources. So that means now that there's a chemical or an enzyme, or in this case a protein, that's inside this product, which it's a chemical derivative of an animal product. This is basically causes well, it presents both a problem and an opportunity for halal certification. So on the one hand, it presents a completely new scenario where now you have to account for halal in non-meat products. On the other hand, it's an opportunity because it expands the potential for halal certification services. It means that now actually we have to now track food technology. I have written about, address separately the way that food technology basically means that halal kind of infiltrates and into a series of previously non-risky or non-considered products, things that went beyond the purview of halal. And what happens after that, around this time, and this is something which I hope to investigate more, part of this ongoing project is to get access to the archives of the people like the NJC and to look at that, to develop this into a book project on what exactly was happening. But I know that 1984 and 1985 all happened very close together. There's also, so you have the Margarine, and then after that you have a split between the Muslim butchers and the MJC. Because the MJC is saying, well, now that this meat is halal, we can sell this halal meat that we are producing in, I think it was in Maitland, the municipal laboratories, and we can basically sell it to Pick and Pay. Obviously, the butchers were not happy about this because basically this was their network, this was their profession, the networks of intra-Muslim trade, they supply meat to the community, and now the ulama, the religious leaders, are telling them, well, actually, we think it's fine, right? So there's a conflict of interests, but also basically what's happening is halal is getting removed from Muslim networks of trade. And that basically is how, that's a particular case study in South Africa of the growth of certification. That still carries on. It only happens in the 90s actually. So the MJC then splits and another organization is formed. So you have then, I think it was about 85, the first, what they call the certification, the Halal Trust. The MJC, the Muslim Judicial, the ulama organization, rather than just providing support services, now decides, okay, well, we're going to break from the butchers and we're going to set up our own separate organization. They set up a trust to basically manage and regulate halal certification in South Africa. And the butchers, what they do is they go to another organization, another religious organization, who then sets itself up. It's called ICSA, the Islamic Council of South Africa. So already now you have, out of this conflict between food technology and the question of where you can sell halal, you have the splitting up and certification is basically emerging. But the real growth of the industry still takes time. It's really after 1994. End of apartheid, major development is the end of the municipal abattoirs. So the deregulation of the meat industry. This creates another problem and opportunity for halal certification, because now it means you have private abattoirs. So it's not as easy to trace halal meat. There's potential for other kinds of products to enter the market. But it also, and imported meat. The things are coming from abroad, so these are new problems, but also again new opportunities, because it means expansion of certification services. You have 1996, another organization is formed. Also, you have, as people have argued in South Africa, increasing basically freedom of movement, right? These are non-white populations, Muslims. So now they are basically moving around, they're coming into shopping malls, hotels, new spaces of consumption, they're demanding halal there. There's also the whole neoliberal kind of reorganization of the economy, and people have argued that there's a new desire in South Africa for people to express their cultural and religious identity. So we can see this kind of constellation happening, and basically there is more demand. And there's a whole lot of meetings that are happening between the different Muslim organizations of what to do. They don't never agree with each other. That's what makes studying Muslims at least gives someone like me something to discuss. So we look at the fractures and the debates and the things that are happening. 1996, Sanha is formed in Durban, and it's the main head office in Durban. But basically, they've got two big offices, one in Durban, one in Johannesburg. They call themselves the South African National Halal Authority. They come from a different kind of theological orientation. They are Deobandi. They are known to be a very conservative kind of Indian-originated Muslim theological kind of sectarian approach. What they do is they basically they do the same thing. They get the butchers associations in Johannesburg area, so the Witwatersrand Butchers Association. They get a number of religious organizations together, and they basically say that they're going to set up a new halal organization. This is the third one that gets established, and it has basically now become the most influential. There's another sectarian split within Sanha, within this national organization, and you have the fourth one. So basically, I deal with these four organizations mainly. There is a fifth one now, so I should change my, I keep on writing there's only four, but there actually is quite a fifth one which has established itself. There's a couple of other small people. Now the thing with this development in 1996 is important because this is now, they're calling themselves the National Halal Authority. They want to standardize and regulate halal. Sanha is Deobandi. They're known for a very kind of austere scriptural emphasis on ritual practice. These are the arguments people like Barbara Metcalf and other people have made about this kind of sectarian development. So they believe that they believe in a very almost like a ritual technocratic approach to practice. Right? They emphasize a series of, that's what they're famous for. But importantly, they're also they come from the Indian trader communities, which means they're different kind of ethnic and also they're different kinds of backgrounds from South Africa, Cape Town, predominantly Malay kind of Muslim communities. But also, so they have a kind of a business, they have a kind of an insight into basically how business works, how trading works, and how the economy is working. And they have told me very clearly that when they started, they realized that they need to basically target people like steers. If you want to make halal certification, you need to go to famous brands. This is the approach they established. They understood that, and they want to basically create nationwide, right? So their approach is listed companies, large manufacturers. Sanha is also a founding member of the World Halal Council, established around 96 in the mid-90s, based in, I think the World Halal Council is Jakarta. They're also members of another kind of world. There's a series of these umbrella organizations, Malaysia, Indonesia, and more recently some of the Middle East countries have come in to try and start. So these were basically World Halal, these were organizations that were established by these certification organizations from across the world who come together in these annual conferences to discuss new developments in halal, new technology about halal, new ways of approaching halal, and they then disseminate that information back to all over the world. And they were founding member of this organization, which is also quite significant. So what is the certification? Right? So that's basically the background. So you've got these four organizations, you've got slightly different approaches. Some of my work in another article, I focus on Sanha, the way that they basically approach halal, the way that they emphasize these. I argue that they produce certification in a particular way. Because certification, like I said, the question of trust in the pre-certification practice of halal is basically based on premise on intra-Muslim practices of trade, right? Dealing with other Muslims, eating at their houses, buying from them, and it's basically also importantly limited to meat. It is predominantly about meat. It's about eating the right meat. So in South Africa, people were very happy and quite comfortable to eat a margarita pizza at St. Elmo's or a toasted cheese sandwich at Mumbai without experiencing some kind of breakdown of the self or any kind of major crisis. And this is a very common practice in South Africa, for example. And it has come across, so. But with certification, that's no longer acceptable, right? Because, well, this is what they basically promote. So part of the Sanha campaign, and part of this kind of introduction of halal certification as a new, what I'm calling a discursive and material regime of halal certification, of halal practice at least, certification as a new kind of development in halal practice, is that they develop two new kind of areas of, they develop two new concepts, right? Two new areas of emphasis. And the one is food technology, right? Which basically deals with things like gelatin, something called shellac, almost everything you have. If you look at the back of products today, you see E numbers. So standardized European codes for particular kinds of food ingredients. So basically, food technology, so in the communication that Sanha presents to people, food technology presents a kind of a risk or threat to halal practice. You can no longer be sure of your own stability in your practice. You have to check even your home. This is the kind of the way that they communicate this. Nothing is safe, you have to have us, you have to have a certificate. The next one is cross-contamination. Cross-contamination is the idea that halal and non-halal must not come into physical contact with each other at any point during the production, supply, and retail of food. So that means you need separate fridges, you need separate transport trucks, you need separate kitchens, kind of separation. The term cross-contamination is interesting. So cross-contamination is it's also clearly a very new development. It has a kind of a murky predecessor maybe in ideas of impurity, of najasat, najis, right? Which basically are things that are impure, certain bodily secretions, blood, these things are impure. There's this idea that if these impurities come into contact with your food, of course that renders your food not allowed. But what happens here with cross-contamination is the transformation of that discourse. So what you actually are saying is that now actually halal and non-halal must not come into physical contact with each other. Meaning that, and this now also applies to, for example, there's another paper which I've written on food technology, the technicalities of it, but it's basically, what they say is that non-halal beef can contaminate halal beef. But according to the ideas of purity, impurity, and permissibility, non-halal beef is not impure. Not necessarily impure. Pork meat is impure. Feces, urine, and things are impure. Non-halal meat hasn't necessarily been discussed as an impurity, as najas in that way. So they take this idea, transfer it into this idea of cross-contamination. So cross-contamination basically says that it's a strict boundary of halal and non-halal, right? The thing with cross-contamination is that this term has been developed since the post-World War II period as a major development in food technology and food science. So if you go to food technology, food safety manuals, they mention cross-contamination as basically procedures, a series of procedures that ensure that there is no mixing between different kinds of meat products. So chicken and beef mustn't mix, meat and vegetable products mustn't mix, and it is in order to prevent to prevent the growth of bacteria and all kinds of things. So it's actually a very, the term itself, it stems from this kind of food safety and food safety protocols, which comes into this practice of halal. What it means now is that you can't, cross-contamination means that, according to this argument, is that you cannot eat a margarita pizza at a place that is not halal. You can't have a toasted cheese sandwich at Wombi. And this presented a transformation because what it does is it also, like food technology, it establishes doubt as the first principle, where the pre-certification practice of halal argued that doubt was something which you should withhold, which should not be charged against someone, right? Especially when you are in these kind of Muslim networks of trade. Doubt is an offense against the integrity of the person. Here, with food technology and cross-contamination, these are invisible risks to halal. They basically foreground doubt. The Muslim consumer is supposed to say, well, we don't know what's happening, so we look for the certification logo. And the certification logo means that cross-contamination has been avoided, prevented, and food technology is all safe. Everything about this food technology has been checked, and it's all halal. So, in the way that this cross-contamination and food technology are communicated, the unintentional transgression of halal is no longer features. There's no longer an option. People are being asked to check for the halal certificate in advance of consuming. They're also being asked to go and check their own kitchens and their fridges. They're asked to look at ingredients lists to see whether this is halal. That means that basically the way that the discourse is promoted, the way that people speak about it, if you don't check, then you are necessarily negligent. It no longer fits into the unintentional transgression. So what through food technology and cross-contamination, halal certification actually eliminates the unintentional transgression as a permissible route for halal practice. It seeks to eliminate it. What certification and pre-certification, I treat these as two kind of another difference between the two, where the pre-certification practice of halal had nothing to do, but it was not about obtaining material certainty over the substance consumed. It was about ensuring that you consume in the right place from the right people. It was not about the material certainty. What halal certification introduces a kind of a molecular halal, a kind of a which people like Nicholas Rose and these people have discussed as a molecularization of kind of contemporary life. It's basically going to a scientific reason. It basically claims to establish material certainty over the product. That certificate is supposed to say that nothing in that thing, right down to the DNA test. And halal certification introduced all kinds of new kind of tests. For example, even DNA tests. DNA tests that can be applied to chocolates, which can now tell you whether there was some kind of meat or non-halal meat enzyme in there. And there's a big controversy 2 years ago in Malaysia where they routine DNA test in the supermarket and they found that there was pork DNA in a Cadbury chocolate. So that's clearly a major it's a transformation. It's a transformation in how you relate to the substance. It's a transformation in the way that intention is related to performance. Because with certification, there's no option for unintentional transgression. You as an individual are supposed to safeguard yourself. You are supposed to, you're supposed to make sure in advance. And importantly, it basically is a whole new material terrain, of global trade, but also of scientific kind of research, right? Of a molecular, it's a shift to a molecular base for practicing halal. It's kind of like what some anthropologists call, someone like Webb Keen discusses as what he calls a semiotic ideology. The transformation, he describes modernity as a new kind of semiotic ideology where the relationship between words, things, and peoples are differently configured. Right? So examples of this are, for example, the things that he talks about are the development of bookkeeping techniques in, I don't know where it was, Europe or America, but the new techniques of bookkeeping in the 19th century did not just have effects on, it wasn't just about how to trade or how to write, it was actually had broader effects in the whole field of, right, all the way to literature and moral philosophy. As somebody called Mary Poovey argues. So basically what you have, a change in one domain, in this case, scientific change, has effects in the way that the relationship of the self to the intention is basically reconfigured, and has relationship to where the society is reconfigured, and a new moral subject is kind of produced or is promoted. Yeah, so in this case, it's a consuming subject, a subject that eats halal in public space, that eats McDonald's, right? That thinks about halal in every kind of space, but it's a consuming subject. And abstinence is not an option. For halal certification, abstinence is not the route to ensuring halal. It's actually consuming, but as long as the certification is there. However, the ideas of like semiotic ideology that and this is where I finally get into my argument here, is that, or at least what this paper is talking about. So this background I've given you is some other work that I've been writing on and looking at different aspects of it. But finally, at the final instance, what happens with these kind of totalizing arguments like semiotic ideology or neoliberalization of practice is that they are totalizing, right? There's a production of a new kind of model subject and a kind of an obliteration of, of these old forms. There's a major transformation. It's depersonalizing, it's molecularizing, and it's about the capitalist economy. And what I found when I was going through the narratives of people talking about their practice, thinking about it, and also observing, through observation of practice, I wasn't happy with this sort of transformation argument. So, this argument that I'm presenting in this paper is that what people do, that there are two, you can call them material and discursive regimes for halal practice, two basically. Right? There's the certification and the pre-certification practice for halal. I'm arguing that they still continue to exist. Pre-certification practice of halal, as part of a discursive tradition of Muslim practice, is embedded into local, everyday understandings, and so it does not get eliminated through this kind of material focus. But actually, we have very interesting overlaps, interesting continuations, but also breaks. So it's not that it's a continuation of the past. It's not that it's a complete transformation, but there's something that trying to figure out, but I think that it's got to do with ethics and the way that individuals chart routes for practice, navigate the world in new, always innovative ways. So I'll hopefully be able to show you that, and you'll think that makes sense the way I explained it. So, arguments about halal. So, basically, it's a very small terrain. Not many people really want to study halal. Right? It's a very small field of practice. But it's a growing field of practice because of its increasing visibility around the world, and also just generally the Muslim problem. A lot of people in Europe are starting to increasingly look at this question. Right? It's becoming, in the public sphere, it's a big debate in Europe especially. So far there have been, basically people study halal as halal consumption. They study it as a kind of form of consumption in line with other kinds of consumption studies. So halal consumption becomes an expression of ethnicity. It becomes an expression of a Muslim consumer identity. It becomes inflected by the migrant experience, by the Muslim migrant experience in the West. These are three very important frames, right? Just it's standing for. And then more recently, somebody has written about halal certification as a kind of a neoliberal transformation in line with the move towards ordered cultures. What Marilyn Strathern in Anthropology already in the 90s discusses ordered cultures, a kind of a neoliberal transformation to a documentary basis. Well, she was looking at higher education and the way that higher education was increasingly, which I think we have, I must say in the middle here, increasingly being about documentary reports, graphs, all kinds of measures of competence. And in this way, halal certification, according to this author, basically is exhibiting this kind of transformation to a desire to fix, document, and trace halal. Those arguments are all fine. But like I said, my issue is with, I started when I wrote my master's thesis in 6 or 7 years ago, I was writing about the neoliberalization of halal practice and the way that it's being transformed, but I was also faced with some complexities, and I guess in the master's I didn't attach to it. Now that I've had some time to think about it, I'm finding that these, like I suggested, that the neoliberalization arguments don't actually give enough recognition or give enough weight to actually how people think. Because neoliberal arguments suggest that there is a neoliberal kind of reasoning this way, a very modern, hyper-modern kind of reasoning that is going to. I'm saying that of course does take place, and that's why we have something like halal certification, but actually the way people practice is never in line with the frame. So, that's the first reason why I'm trying to discuss this. The second reason I'm discussing, what time did we start?
Just after the
Yeah.
one.
Oh, just after one.
I think you've got another 15 minutes.
No, you've got to
Pretty much.
enough time.
Okay, so maybe I gave you too much background. But
Don't worry.
hopefully I didn't bore you. So, okay, so that's the one idea. The other thing is this question that basically the idea is that halal consumption is about ethnicity, consumer identities, migrant identities, any kinds of expressions. It's a kind of a functional analysis. Where the practice of halal stands in for other kinds of things, right? So it's a performance which expresses something else, right? Either it's the way you express your identity, your consumer identity. Now, Talal Asad, this is where I work with in the Anthropology of Islam, and Talal Asad is a very influential figure who basically made major contributions to the Anthropology of Islam and Anthropology of Ethics. And he did this actually together. So to study Islamic practice like I do Muslim practice is really, has to be to study ethics. Because even the field of Anthropology of Ethics was heavily tied to this question of, so the thing was, Asad had a critique of functionalism and structural functionalism. Because he basically said that it doesn't capture the moods and motivation of practitioners. It doesn't actually consider what is happening in the place. It sees practice always in regards to other kinds of frames. And it has to understand things for the people. Right? You have to basically, the people say stuff, and we then put the frame and say this is what we're doing. What Asad was saying, what Talal Asad suggested was that actually the Western academic tradition is a discursive tradition. It is a tradition of thought and a tradition of practice. It's a way of looking at other people. Those people, wherever they are in the world, also have their own traditions of thought and traditions of practice. And the reason why there was, and this was happening in the 70s, and the critique of that whole paradigm, but he suggested that you have to look at the longer durée of people, the kind of the textual production, past practice, and how basically, he focused on Islam, but basically there's an idea of moral personhood that you can understand by looking at how people think about themselves and the way they understand it. So he had a very strong critique of the British school of structural functionalism and all these people, which I think is still quite relevant today. Obviously, what we do, the kind of thing I'm saying, but the question of ethics is basically to say we're going to look at the practice. We're going to look at the forms of reasoning. We're going to take their forms of reasoning, their vocabularies, their ways of thinking seriously. So this spawned a very rich field for the Anthropology of Islam. Also, importantly, his argument was that Islam is a discursive tradition. Modernity is also a discursive tradition. A discursive tradition basically means that there's intertextual kinds of, it means that it means that contemporary practice has to be understood in terms of the long durée of Muslim practice, of past texts, past practices, and also authority, the way people learn, the way people do things. It becomes embodied, inscribed on the self, right? So basically, his main contribution and what his students did was they then suggested, well, we can study Islam in terms of piety. So very influential, Sabah Mahmood and Charles Hirschkin suggested that, okay, so piety is the primary ethical practice in Islam. All Islamic practice, all Muslim practices have a kernel of piety within them. They change in the contemporary world. Yes, they are moving. There might be differences. Importantly, his other contribution in the discursive tradition was the ethics part and the formation of the model personhood, but also the prevalence of debate and difference within the Islamic discursive tradition. So debate and difference does not signal a multiplication or fragmentation. It actually means that there's a discursive debate and they're having an implicit dialogue with each other. So what they took then to be, his students, the people who followed this up, didn't actually look at the debate and difference. But what they rather did was they homed in on this piety, at the kernel in Islamic practice, which can be traced to a long tradition of thought. And so they study questions of piety, the prayer movements, or listening in Cairo, and there's a whole field of this. And what they do is they then, by studying piety as the kernel of Islam, as the primary ethical practice of Islam, they're able to have an ethical, idea of a model personhood, of a Muslim model personhood that is basically a counterpoint to some idea of Western liberal norms, which they also then construct. What happens then with so this is one very powerful movement which I am drawing on by showing discursive continuity, but also there's a critique of this. And people are saying, actually, no, white Muslims are not always pious all the time, they actually do other things. So the critics of this movement, somebody called Samuel Shilka, but a whole they call it everyday Islam. They actually say that, well, Islam is about piety. They agree on that point. But what they do is they say, but Muslims also like to go to the movies and they like to have fun and they like to fall in love and they have family and they have other things. So you have moral registers in life which basically pull people in different directions, at which point they transgress or they compromise themselves in order to make these pragmatic adjustments in life. There are the two frames of how to study ethics and practice. So in the one, ethics is piety. In the other one, ethics is a kind of ambivalence and fragmentation that is basically endemic to life, and so what they do is they trace moments of breakdown, moments of ambivalence, moments where the Islamic norm is not working. So, but they both. So, what I do here, I'm basically saying that halal is not about piety. As we're seeing, it's about eating together. It's not about piety. It can't be reduced to piety. It's about networks of trade. It's about consuming. So, firstly, the piety arguments are oversimplified. And but on the other hand, I suggest that actually there's no that ambivalence is a problematic frame through which to study these issues, and actually we should rather think about ethics as the way people make judgments through which they establish new routes for practice. I've actually going way too long. I'll get back.
Truly, we'll have enough time for this.
I'm going to.
So really,
I should have been much. Sorry, guys. I should have been much better with my planning. So ethics is my. So okay, I'll give you my my point. But basically, what I do is instead of using piety as the supreme norm or the supreme ethical practice, or take piety as still the ethical practice of Islam, but then see moments of ambivalence or fragmentation, I have been drawing on on Wittgenstein, who suggests that actually, and his analysis of language in use, and that is that the rules of a game are the norms of a language, the norms in society are not boundaries to be crossed, but they are signposts. He speaks about signposts. So he has his ideas of language game. People have read him in many different ways, but I think actually what he's suggesting is that repetition or imitation is actually impossible. Every kind of, he suggests that in language in use is a series of, we make up the rules as we go along, even as we maintain that we're playing the same game. That's quote here, right? So we make up the rules, even though we maintain we're playing the same game. I'm using this to say ethics. Ethics is when people who have a commitment or an attachment to a particular kind of ethical good, idea of the good, make up the rules as they go along, and therefore do not necessarily perceive their own practice as a breakdown, as a transgression. So the arguments about transgression are actually based on this oversimplified norm. Another very important argument of Wittgenstein is that exact and inexact are not descriptions of objective facts. The idea of exactness and inexactness are not descriptions of objective facts, they're actually morally charged statements of evaluation. So in the same way that this idea of Islam as piety, or piety as the norm, is not just merely a description of facts, it is actually it is a moral evaluation. I think it's an evaluation that has entered the anthropology, and that people are not, and that's why and it's giving rise to this debate. So I'm suggesting that you do have poles of authority, you do have signposts for authority, but we have to look at the forms of reasoning and the processes people go to which they make this, and that's basically what ethics is. So let me tell you my stories now. Way too much concept, but I hope the background was useful. So Feroza was an employee in the finance department of a large listed corporate bank in Johannesburg. She recounted an incident at a year-end function where she reflected on an apparent contradiction in halal practice. All meat served at the restaurant had been sourced from a Muslim supplier. However, the presence of alcohol precluded the possibility for certification. Right? But the people had. So she and her friend Shanaz decided, therefore, they're going to attend the event, but they're not going to eat the food. Then she narrates this to me. It's contradictory, because I had the cappuccino. So there's the washing of the cup with the same alcohol dishes. Potential for cross-contamination, complete separation of everything. But I also think it's a bit overboard. That's where I'll have two minds as well. I just say no, it's just coffee. And then part of me will say it's not just coffee. So the new awareness of halal meant that the bank was now cognizant of Muslim employee demands. The restaurant, similarly, the restaurant ensured all meat was procured from halal sources and held copies of the latest invoices on site for people to inspect. People who didn't have this approach, who didn't mind having coffee in the bar. These developments facilitated the public practice of halal. However, certification had more stringent requirements, right? So alcohol precluded certification, the presence of alcohol. And for the industry, it was because of the potential for cross-contamination. Importantly, the transformation that's happening with cross-contamination is that it's a potential. It's no longer based on what you know, it's based on the possibility to imagine that there could be some potential for contamination. Okay, so Feroza is interesting because cross-contamination and awareness of cross-contamination meant that even though she knew the meat was halal, she wasn't happy with the non-certification, so she would not eat the meat. But cross-contamination, as the industry articulated, it also meant that you should not have drinks there or drink coffee. But she had the coffee. She basically judged that coffee was intrinsically halal. Yeah. So, following some Shilka and ambivalence arguments, this is how they would analyze it, we could consider that the demands of career clash with religious sensibility and provoke a pragmatic adjustment. The kind of analysis that is presented by this way of thinking is that she is evidence of ambivalence or some kind of a transgression. Right? So there's a norm that's being established with cross-contamination and she's unable to meet it. And there's this kind of ambivalence that is being produced. I argue that contrary to Feroza's reflection on contradiction, she had not considered the coffee at the year-end function to be a transgression of halal, because otherwise she wouldn't have drunk it. Halal is a serious matter. It's about basically allowing an impermissible item to enter the body. The intentional consumption of halal is a serious issue. And unintentional consumption is, as we said, a gray area which sometimes can move around. So she made a judgment that it was prudent to abstain from the food, yet drink the coffee. So this is basically, I suggest, it shows the extent to which certification, the discursive and material regime of certification of the terrain has not been hegemonic. And people continue to make recourse to pre-certification arguments about halal, even in the context of certification. So for example, the intrinsically halal nature of coffee is something which means that people, even when they are consumed or are convinced by the logic of halal certification, are still likely to contradict, and that contradiction, or that it is a contradiction in practice, but it's not a fragmentation and ambivalence, it's actually a recourse to a pre-certification practice. Okay, I can just give you another example. So, Feroza and her husband were interested in this matter. So that's an example of how our discursive continuity and transformation. Halal is being extended into new contexts, and all forms of reasoning are being applied in the new context, which is basically the production of the new. So, Feroza had a husband, Ahmed, so I've got some interesting narrative from them, where they, how much time do you think I should? 5 minutes?
5 to 10.
Okay. So, sorry, that was a bad example for you to write at the front. That's how I opened the paper. It's supposed to open up the question. But anyway, it shows the thing, but I'm going to tell you more about Feroza and Ahmed. So they were a married couple. They were both in their mid-30s. They were devout Muslims. They both testified to praying regularly, and Feroza wore the headscarf. They leaned towards the Deobandi sectarian affiliation, known for its emphasis on austere ritualistic practice. They had 2 children, and they were both employed on a full-time basis. Feroza worked in an office, while Ahmed was a sales representative. He traveled a lot for his work. Feroza was on the Sanha mailing list. She was on the mailing list that basically was communicating the issues of cross-contamination food technology to people on a regular basis for the last 15 years. And she was keenly aware of it. She followed these emails and she engaged them. They clearly were aware of cross-contamination in food technology. It came up consistently in their discussions. They were reliant on halal certification, and because they saw it as necessary for facilitating Muslim public consumption. Muslim participation in public life, halal certification was good. It basically, halal consumption facilitated the interaction, right, in work settings and social life. It was also convenient. I think that they were a good example of a kind of a consuming middle class subject. They never, in their discussions, they never question consumption, or excessive consumption, or excess, or these kind of things. They were basically only interested in consumption was good, it was convenient, and basically Muslims should have certification to facilitate this consumption. So, very good example of a kind of a Sanha subject, what Sanha was trying to promote. They never ever spoke about abstinence. That's not an option for them. But the problem in South Africa, and this is where the question of debate and difference with halal, as I mentioned in the discursive tradition of Islam, is that you have 4 organizations. Now these 4 organizations all do halal certification, and one certificate is essentially is supposed to be exchangeable for another. But the problem is because of the interpretation and the reasoning that goes into developing a fatwa, a legal ruling on what constitutes halal, there are always differences of opinion. There are sectarian differences, there are regional differences. So they were aware that there were differences in opinion about halal. Is machine slaughter allowed or not? Is gelatin from non-halal meat still halal? Or is gelatin from non-halal meat not halal? These are important questions that come up because these underlie, and this is another way in which the neoliberal arguments about halal fail to capture the complexity of practice because they see pure exchangeability. When actually what happens in the certification is the continuation of actually a much varied terrain. Now people are aware of this in South Africa, so they explained to me. So Ahmed said he knows about the differences of opinion, but he doesn't really mind. As long as the certificate, he will eat. I believe the Islamic bodies are being manned by Muslim people, and if they're going to pull the wool over our eyes, they're going to have to answer to the maker. So if it's a Muslim body that is certified, they are taking accountability for what we are consuming. Right? This is an example, again, I'm suggesting, of the way in which he's employing a pre-certification notion of halal as premise on intra-Muslim trade in the context of certification. The certification organizations are not necessarily doing this. In fact, Sanha is very clear that its halal is better than the other halal, and we must have this because we are more strict and we are more pure. But for the average person, they are willing to. So again, just because this is an example again of a continuation of a way that this logic, taking accountability, answering to God, bringing in questions of consciousness, it again gets to the question of the intention, of the way that intention is not transferred. Intention is not transferred through the substance in pre-certification practice of law. But the problem is that, so they accept this, so that's one aspect, right? So this shows you how this kind of reasoning continues. But an interesting thing could be, so these are consumed, but they still believe in cross-contamination food technology is very important. And so there's another excerpt here from Firoza, which I think gets to what I'm trying to say about the way in which ethics is about producing a new constellation of practice, charting a new route for practice. It is necessarily about the way in which people basically extend themselves into the world. Now, what she does here with cross-contamination, and this is not unprecedented, because somebody in fact in Singapore writes about the same kind of idea. So cross-contamination idea that things must not mix. But once, like I said, there was some idea of cross-contamination of purity that has been existing in the discursive tradition of Islamic law, of Muslim practice, but a hazy kind of field, not very clear. So cross-contamination provides a theory, it provides a concept, it provides a location for it, and it will provide the tools for imagination through which the risk can be imagined. And what people do is they extend it, right? So in the example in here is that she says, so she's happy to go to the franchise store, Nando's, that's halal certified, right? There's no issue with halal certification in the Nando's store. In fact, because of her husband, they believe in certification to the extent where they're even happy to eat at non-halal certified Nando's. Because Nando's doesn't sell pork, and all the meat they know is being sourced by Rainbow or County Fair, so large corporate producers. They believe in this kind of, in the market and the franchising system, and they basically, we know the suppliers, so everything's fine. They won't even go that far. But she has this kind of reflection in her narrative, which then, as we're discussing this, again comes up as another kind of a reflection on contradiction. The issue is that if they are franchised, they're not allowed to use non-approved suppliers. But at the same time, if the owner is not there, what's stopping a staff member from having his bacon sandwich for lunch, not washing his hands, and coming to prepare food afterwards? He's not bringing any contamination directly into the kitchen. But non-Muslim people have a tendency of not washing their hands. So I don't know. Right? So what she's doing here, she's taking a cultural bias, her own kind of pressure. She's combining it with this imaginative extension of cross-contamination to now apply to the hand. right? The example that came, to even the invisible, the possibility for invisible transfer of the substance, and which but she continues to eat this. That's what I'm saying. I'm not looking at these as the practice, I'm looking at these the way in the narrative is basically produced. The example in Singapore is interesting because they created food courts. Halal, food courts where you have halal and non-halal. And because of the certification emphasis on cross-contamination, they also have different trays, different cutlery, different kind of a separation. But the problem was that people were, is that you have this emphasis on cross-contamination and the separation of space and utensils and cutlery and everything in the food court. And people over there were extending it. So people were reflecting to themselves, what happens now? Because now what happens, you get to the table and you're sitting next to someone who's eating non-halal. And so then the idea came out, at least in that paper there in Singapore, what happens if somebody coughs and they're eating and something flies, right? So what's happening is a kind of an extension and this is beyond what the certification industry could have imagined when they idea, because their idea of certification is to produce certainty. And people, again, are producing again. Give you one more example, just to give a contrast, and then I can just open it up to you guys to tell me what I missed and what you think is not clear or whatever. So Adil, I got another example. He was very young at the time. He identified as a modern Muslim. This is what he called himself. He was very insistent on practicing halal. He was interested in reading particular kind of texts, and he was very active in local kind of youth organizations. He had received emails about cross-contamination and food technology, but he stopped receiving them because he kept on replying in a critical way. So people who sent this list took him off the list. He attended the mosque regularly for prayers, but he always avoided the halal notices. Whenever there was new halal notice, somebody told him, he basically said, I don't care about this stuff, because he thought that they display an excessive concern with technical details. The technicality of halal and this, technocratic emphasis he thought was excessive. So he had this approach, but he still insisted on Muslim slaughtered meat. So when he had been offered meat from his Christian friends, he did not eat their meat, even though he was aware, because of his kind of exposure to a certain discourse of Islam, he was aware that you could extend halal food to people in the book, to Ahlul Kitabs, which technically means that the Christians and Jews are also basically producing halal. But he mentioned this, I know about this, but I still insist on Muslim meat. And he accepted any authority. He said, I know that Islam is full of differences of opinions, and basically this is just something that I need to ensure my consumption. But he was not worried about drinking Coca-Cola at a bar, and he wasn't worried about margarita pizza, and he definitely wasn't worried about that. So but he still relied on it. And he described when he was in America and how he was able to go to the Walmart and buy lamb chops. He was vegetarian for the rest of the time, but he was able to buy lamb chops because they came from Indonesia, so it was halal certified. So he was, in that sense, happy with halal certification. Again, premised on the fact of Muslim involvement. If a Muslim person gives it to you, in my mind it's halal. My conscience is clear if someone tells me this is halal. Interesting with him, I forgot it in this paper, he extends that to non-Muslims also. And I found this also in India when I was doing research. This idea that you should not doubt another Muslim, people also extend that to non-Muslims. So finally they say, okay, if the waiter tells me it's halal, I'll use it. Right? So there's a question of how, basically, I think it's quite important how trust is established. So his reflection on cross-contamination is very interesting. I don't know how contamination works. Like haram is a disease. Haram means impermissible. It's the opposite of halal. Like haram is a disease or parasite that jumps from the bacon onto the cheese. I don't get that. Okay, yes, maybe there's 0.5 milligram of pork on the person's hand. Right? So it's already, you can see this discussion. But I don't think on the day of judgment is a crucial factor. So here, I want to point out firstly that he's basically, it's a critique of the logic of the halal certification industry, but it's also an implicit dialogue with a broader kind of issues that are going on in the community. A discursive tradition that is evolving, that is being produced, through these new terms and this new terrain. There's a new terrain of halal certification, and people are engaging with it. He also, the issue of gelatin. People were worried about gelatin. Can you eat gelatin? Halal, non-halal sources, big debate since 1982 when the first fatwa came out, it's an issue. And now you get gelatin in South African stores, which some of it is basically, they both say halal, but the one is from halal slaughtered animals, they imported from Pakistan, and the other one is from non-halal slaughtered animals that is in South Africa. So you have halal products that are both from very different places of origin. And so this is a big debate. So he was basically he wasn't concerned about gelatin. So I guess give you these other two. So I think halal. So now what he does though, as he's in his narrative, as he's reflecting on this, is he's also giving me his kind of idea. What is the ethical good in halal? Where for Feroz and Ahmed, the good that they subscribe to is the Muslim participation in public life. It is the ability to consume freely. It is convenience, right? So they believe in the technocratic impulse. For him, this good is actually, but he'll explain it now. I think it's like I think halal is about cruelty to animals and the way you treat the animal before it dies. So that's in my mind what it means. Also, a little bit of gelatin that was extracted through some long process. I don't know how that affects the moral chain of the holy print, to the language. So he doesn't care about the technicalities of gelatin, whether it's halal or not halal, and all these questions, but he thinks that, and he's also articulating actually a different, an idea of care through this idea of halal, rather than idea of specificity of slaughter, even though he still maintains the slaughter has to be done, because that's why he's not eating Christians' produce meat. Another one of his, and this is the extent to which he goes, and this is about porcine derivatives, so pork derivatives. So even the people that accept, okay, fine, non-halal gelatin, you can eat it, the question of the pork derivative, because it basically crosses over into this question of impurity of a very strong boundary. What is the spirit of the law? Don't eat pork. Why would God not want me to eat pork? The reason is because it's a filthy animal that doesn't have the sense enough to disregard its own feces. So it carries certain diseases. Now I'm going to get that disease from eating yogurt because it had E450. I don't think so. I'm going to eat the yogurt. I'm not even going to check on a pack of jelly beans or jelly tots, basically any jelly stuff. Now the thing about him is interesting, is that he's taken recourse to a very familiar idea in South Africa and maybe across the world, that the prohibition amongst Muslims, that the prohibition on pork relates to cleanliness. So that the pig is a dirty animal and it breeds disease, and so therefore that's why there's a nice scientific logic to halal. So there's a common thing. But he basically, through that, he's now disregarding, he's using the question of health, right, which is a common argument, to now make an argument why porcine derivative is no longer a problem with halal. So he's again extending this course, making his own judgment. But importantly, he still remains within a terrain of discursive tradition of Muslim practice, because he's not willing to say that actually in the contemporary world, pig farming has radically changed, and so maybe the incidence of tapeworm and all these things don't matter, so pigs are halal. He's not willing to go over that boundary, that particular kind of, thing, but he's working around the boundary, or the idea. And so therefore I argue that rather than seeing him as a transgression, or rather, it's quite clear. He's not transgressing, he's negotiating and navigating the signposts for halal that are available in this world in the production of something new. Okay, so anthropologists have offered a variety of functional analysis of the meaning of halal practice in the contemporary world. Halal consumption is presented as an expression of consumer, ethnic, minority identities, and certification is understood as a neoliberal transformation of halal. They have missed the longer durée of the shifts, innovations, and continuities of halal practice in the world and of ethics as central to practice. The article has sought to address this lacuna through attention to the importance of ethics for practice. I have argued for an appreciation of ethics as the way in which individuals chart new rules for practice as they navigate the dominant signposts of authority and materiality on offer. Muslims make judgments on how to practice halal in new contexts, and in doing so they draw on prevalent discourses and debates, even as they innovate through practice. So I suggest we have to look at narratives, practices, and forms of reasoning, which has afforded us a view to the importance of ethical reflection, deliberation, and innovation, as well as discursive continuity in the practice world.
How about stopping there?
I'm done. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I think that is the place, unless you want to add more. But otherwise we are going to cut into time, but I think you've given us an enormous amount to think about. So I think it is a good time to open up for discussion. We do have enough time, more than enough time. So thanks very much.
Okay,
it's a very rich philosophical, anthropological take on this that takes us into a whole range of other issues around ethical practices and the kind of deliberative nature of such practices. They're not written in stone, they're part of lived experience. I found that extraordinary. Okay, so 3 or 4 comments, questions, and yeah, we'll have a couple of rounds. It's a lot of deliberation and processing. And can people please introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thank you. This is Yang. Thanks, Shaheed. I've been grappling to understand this notion of halal. And I'm glad that I'm speaking to somebody who's done research on it.
I saw you in the KFC yesterday.
Yeah. What I really want to understand is what really constitutes halal. Is it the ritual that has been practiced before the animal is slaughtered, or is it the presence of a particular person who commands or who possesses particular powers? Is it something that can be passed on? If, for instance, I sit at a table and I find that the food is not halal, is it something that can we convert, can we change, transform the atmosphere by simply asking somebody to come and do the ritual and so that the food can be consumed?
Oh, can become after the fact.
Yes. So I just want to understand it.
Okay. It's a
Should we
concept.
take
Yes,
a
yes,
couple
yes,
more?
yes.
Thank you. I'll add to his
Could you
question.
introduce yourself? Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
My name
please.
is Salek. I'm with the department. Just in addition to his question, what are these particular rights that makes the slaughtering or butchering of an animal halal?
What are the
What are the
rights?
specific rights?
Hmm.
And then, how does guaranteeing or ensuring these rights for Muslims affect non-Muslims? Oftentimes, when catering services ask questions, do you have any choice for meal?
Yeah.
What we always get is, okay, we are able to provide halal meat, halal food, but what about those who are not interested about eating halal food? How does that affect them?
Is there another question or comment? Please can you introduce yourself.
Yes, Kees van der Waal. I found it very interesting how you focused on the changing perceptions and practices and around the categories of purity that you discussed and how this became more specific over time. Now, I was wondering, as a consumer, I see sometimes that both the kosher and halal signs are certified on a certain product. And as you said, across the Muslim divisions, there is cooperation around halal certification. Is there any level of cooperation around kosher and halal ever? And secondly, are these changes that you pointed out parallel to other fields, for instance, clothing, prescriptions around that, and developments in politics? In other words, do we find an increasing conservatism that is underlying this, what you have pointed out, contextually speaking?
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me start. What is halal? Well, as a discursive tradition, it's not one thing, right? It's varied. There are, like I discussed, there are sectarian, regional differences in how halal is interpreted in practice. At its basic, it is basically a ritual of slaughter, right? It does not require specific people to do the slaughter. So halal, it's kind of like kosher light. It's kind of like the rules of the kashrut, which are basically just reduced to slaughter. That is the basic at its basic level. Now you ask an interesting question. If you add a halal table, can you make the thing, can you turn it around? So part of the interpretations, this is where it comes in. You can see someone shaking their head, they're like, no, why is it not halal, it's not halal? Well, there's a very famous tradition of the Prophet where the people brought him an animal from the desert, and the people from the desert had given it to him. They were these Magians, or priests like that. I don't know what the Magians are. They're kind of pagan religion. So they were there, and then they gave the people the meat. So the guys came to the Prophet and asked him, "What do we do with this meat? We don't know where it came from. We don't know how it's slaughtered, and these people gave it to us, and they're not Muslim." And so he said, "Say the prayer in the name of God and eat the meat." That is an authoritative practice of halal also. So it can be transformed. It's not very common in South Africa. You find this much more in the Arab world. There's a particular Maliki school of thought, where they actually practice this. They also practice the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book. So they go to McDonald's with the idea that it's halal, not because of the certificate, but because they perceive an American company to be Christian, to stand for Christianity, and then they say, and then they transform it, or they add that security through the. So there's a debate about the timing of the prayer, there's a debate about slaughter. These things have existed. But in general, no. You don't really transform it. It's really about the practice. I think it's most of the time, well, yeah, so there's a bit of both. It depends on who you speak to also, and how they basically practice, with background they come from. So that covers some of the rights. It's basically a halal slaughter. It basically means the animal has to be cut by a Muslim person. Everything else is fine. So that's why I'm saying, unlike the rules of kosher, which I'm not so familiar with, but there are issues about who is slaughtering, and there are issues about maybe even when, time of the week even, like certain times you cannot, and there are also issues about other kinds of products that could potentially. But with the halal law, it's literally just a slaughter. Anybody can touch the meat afterwards, anybody can do anything. There's nothing about it. There's never really a concern. So in today's world, what you have is you have chicken abattoirs. I use an example, or abattoirs, which I've visited and seen how they operate. It's the most simplest thing in the world to make a halal abattoir. Chicken abattoir in South Africa, like County Fair, got 120,000 chickens a day. These chickens are basically coming through on conveyor belts. They travel at a certain speed per second. There are two Muslim people who stand there. The animal is shocked, so it's lying limp. It moves on this conveyor belt. An extremely sharp knife comes past, and the guy just basically, with a slight slit of his knife, the neck starts to hang, the blood pours out, and the production line takes over. You only need the slaughterer to be Muslim in order to ensure halal. So also the expansion of halal around the world is partly because of this. It's partly because of its ease, right? The other thing is that modern meat industry also, another very important thing about halal is that they want, and same with kosher, I guess, is that they want the blood has to be out. The blood has to flow out of the body, right? So that's why you don't cut the spinal cord, the nerves. You only cut the first two, these things here, the jugular and the windpipe, free. So what happens then is that the animal basically bleeds to death. Convulsions in the body pump the blood out. Now the thing is that modern meat industry also does this. They also basically bleed animals. You don't get in, especially unless for very specialized things, it is a widely agreed upon industry practice that you cut at the jugular and you bleed the animal. So this also means for Muslims it was quite easy, right? Because they don't need specially trained religious people. They don't need anything. You just put someone. So in trades, there's a lot of people from West Africa, Somalia, who you'll find working in these abattoirs. They employ them as laborers. That's the, so basically it's easy to do. So in fact, then there's an argument by a very famous scholar, Yusuf Qaradawi, who's based in Qatar or someone, a very important Salafi scholar. He argues that all meat in the world is halal because of this. So his argument is that actually this is the thing, draining the blood. Say the prayer on your plate, make sure the blood is drained. He does a study of modern food requirements, these kind of ISO standards, and he's like, forget about this stuff. Just eat. Of course, the reason I'm talking about certification is those type of opinions are not amenable to the certification industry. It doesn't really work when you're trying to commercialize, commodify, and make a thing or something. And non-Muslims are technically not affected physically in terms of the physical stuff, like I'm saying, because literally that's what they do. They just replace, they put two people in it. And they do this anywhere in the world, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Australia, whether it's anything, migrants are everywhere. It's very easy to find poor Muslims somewhere and just put their laborers. This is a form of labor. And it's not like they dominate the industry, they just literally need to be at the slaughtering place. But, of course, there are politics around that. So if you're asking about politics, there are these politics. So in South Africa, every now and again, you'll hear the very right-wing conservative Christian groups who will be like, they see halal on their Easter eggs, and they're like, we knew it. This is, Islam is taking over, and this is Easter, and every Easter this will come. Somebody will write about this every Easter. That, we knew it, they're creeping. And then in America, they call it creeping Sharia. Like they're getting into us, and Americans love to coin words and everything. And then they in England, they've also got this anxiety or worry because people are finding out only in the last 2-3 years everything's halal. So almost all the meat production, even in a place like the UK, just because of the small. And partly it's the ease, and partly it's also the export market and the demand. If it's so easy to do and you've got a market, why not just do it? So that's also part of the logic of why the companies control it. People like Nestle. I don't know about any cooperation between them. In terms of consumption, Muslims can eat kosher. What halal certification does is it makes Muslims not want to eat kosher. You don't need it. As far as I'm concerned, if before certification came around, people would happily look at the kosher sign on a product and be like, this is fine. They would go to Jewish restaurants when they went overseas especially, and they would basically rely on it. Certification, I think that's what you're pointing to, it does facilitate a particular kind of, right, or it promotes a certain kind of identitarian, not seclusion, but identitarian participation in public life. So you're in public life, you're definitely not secluded, but you are definitely now saying, no, I want my halal thing. And so a lot of people, when I do research and stuff, they're not kosher, they're not too sure. But okay, when they go overseas. So this, also then again, you can look at this, I have to look more at this, like again, the way that they reason about when you can and cannot eat kosher, which has always also been an issue. So people, even though they're allowed to eat kosher, they often only would do it in cases when it's necessity. So again, going into a particular form of reasoning within the tradition, which basically is laying out the terrain. But I think this extreme kind of emphasis, this extreme kind of technical emphasis on checking every product and asking your friends and family. So people are going to, this is a new development, they go to the home of a family member and then they want to know where you buy the chicken. We want to see. They want to see the box and the package. This kind of a thing is definitely changing. That aspect of halal, I would agree that it's a kind of a pietization of halal. But there's a discourse with somehow, with this kind of neoliberal discourse, actually also emphasizing piety. So you're supposed to protect the self, so you wear the religious clothing, but you protect yourself through consumption. It's again, it's a very strange kind of, because before you're supposed to protect yourself through abstinence. And anyway, the last example I had is a guy who followed a very, very strict kind of, abstinence emphasized kind of, orientation, and for them, like ethics of halal is about protecting the body. It's about in the case where you're not sure you abstain, you can eat less, so you don't eat huge meals. You definitely don't just go out and spend, unnecessarily. You spend time growing your food. They're kind of an austere, also an austere Sufi kind of idea that it's about self and basically what hide. That's another example. So you get people that emphasize that, but what happened is somehow kind of perhaps takes that kind of discourse, which is a minority, and produces it as a kind of, to the public, presents it to the public as a form of being. So everybody talking about piety, and they're talking about whether you can protect self, and the ideas about taqwa. Taqwa means God consciousness, which is what the students of Mahmoud talk about. But, so there definitely is that move, but I find that it's not, there's more people negotiating and navigating. There's very few people. And it's not a linear movement. That's why I'm trying to bring in the contextual and the personal, and because it's not a linear movement as people predicted. And that's why there's still the debate carry on contestation. But I think it is definitely a kind of, there definitely is this kind of modern conservative which comes into it.
Great. We have time for one more round of questions, comments. Could you introduce?
Yeah, I'm Eli Carlson. As I'm sure you're surprised to learn. Thank you. It's a fascinating talk. I love the idea of protecting oneself through consumption. I'll have to try that, even though I'm not Muslim. I wanted to ask you a little more about ambivalence, I guess. I mean, I kind of had this initial thought, I don't know if you'll find it glib, which is that kind of the idea of functionalism and ambivalence being two possible interpretations of these kinds of practices are, being kind of the kind of obsolete theoretical positions that you're rejecting so that you can go on to develop an analysis about moral reasoning. I mean, I just want to have it out there that these are not mutually exclusive. Things can't have functions, and one can also be having kind of moral reasoning. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. I guess so. I've been thinking about ambivalence a bit lately, kind of as a way of forestalling bad events, like a way of processing ambiguity that keeps open situations in such a way that one does not have to kind of, allow catastrophe to actually happen. So when I listen to kind of this utterance, like it's just coffee, but part of me will say no, it's not just coffee, which is a marvelous utterance. I mean, it seems to me that precisely is ambivalence, and ambivalence precisely is a form of reasoning. Ambivalence is a way of trying to kind of make your way through something that is affectively potentially negatively charged. I mean, I take it that transgressing halal codes would be an excellent example of something highly charged, right?
Yeah.
And is precisely kind of a way of trying to explore, okay, I'm feeling apprehension about this, like, how must I think about this so as to avoid the apprehension culminating in this kind of experience of having transgressed. So I guess I just wanted to ask you, what is ambivalence to you or to these people who have written about it, which I haven't read, and kind of what's the relationship between ambivalence and reasoning? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine.
Any other comments, questions?
I was gonna.
Yeah,
I just
can you
want.
introduce yourself?
Sorry,
Introduce
I'm Lloyd. Nice to meet you. That's right, from the Department of Sociology. If I could just kind of ask for clarification on how you're kind of criticizing this idea of neoliberalization, and within the context of halal. So on the one hand, you're arguing yes, with the kind of Wittgensteinian notion of game, that it's not just one kind of unifying global economy. But I wonder if you could say more about, is it just okay, they are on a local scale kind of reinventing the practice and redefining the rules and redefining it, but is there more to it than this, in the sense that they're also maybe quite distinct economies, immediately sub kind of whatever the global standards are emerging into different parts of the world? How do these certificates work? Was the word you're looking for just now fungibility? Are they more or less fungible in different contexts?
Circulation of certificates.
Circulation, and how do they work as a kind of a currency?
Okay, yeah, and how they shape. Okay, that's very interesting. Thanks.
Final comment, question? Or? Okay, want to address these two.
Okay, cool. Okay, so obviously functionalism is nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it. This is not my particular interest. I started off, obviously, writing about consumer identities, and I felt it wasn't. I wanted to do a bit more. I wanted to go more into both the question of what this halal actually is, what it tells us about how Muslims experience and live in the world, and also I wanted to go more into the philosophical questions of basically practice and ethics, which I think offers a more rich avenue of analysis than just sticking with consumer identity as the final, because it's the end, right? Ethics allows us to think about the process, about how people are not yet arrived at their identities, but they are somehow developing. So, and also it is a popular field, so that's what everybody's doing nowadays. Well, at least when I started my research, this was the big thing. But also because anthropology of Islam is very much tied up to ethics. Ever since Talal Asad basically made these very provocative contributions, and then his whole critique of modernity and religion, and his whole project is basically in this direction. And so it's kind of an unavoidable way. And also because I have always been drawn to his work, because I think it makes sense that the people he were critiquing were either defining Islam too narrowly or saying that they're just multiples. So it's either the kind of modernist approach where there is this Islam, or the kind of a postmodernist who are saying, oh, they're just multiples. Everybody's doing their own thing and it's all contextual. And so Talal Asad's contribution to using this discourse discursive tradition, which he himself takes from Wittgenstein and Foucault and these people, but basically he's saying, no, you're not understanding. Difference is internal to a tradition. Right? So Kant and Foucault are also part of the tradition of European philosophy. Doesn't mean just because they hate each other. Right? There's a tradition. Difference is not the marker of fragmentation. So that for me was very important to get into this question. Ambivalence. My problem with ambivalence, right, is that it is a judgment. Ambivalence is the judgment. I'm not saying that there are not moments of ambivalence, that people are not able to experience ambivalence. But in anthropology, ambivalence seems to be both the theory and the answer, in the way that it's presented. So suddenly, we have this theory of ambivalence, the world's ambivalent, and then also then the conclusions everybody makes is, oh yeah, people experiencing ambivalence in the world is open. I don't subscribe to these kind of ideas, because the world is much more fixed with structures than this kind of post-structure has moved to ambivalence, I want to admit. And ambivalence is specifically a kind of a retort, right, to a modernist certainty. Right? So there's a certainty of this modernist paradigms, and then there's this kind of focus on the fluid and emerging nature of life, and ambivalence stands there. I agree with the fluid emergent nature of life. I'm happy with that part. I'm just not happy with the ambivalence part. Because I could not sure how to point bend this, at which point does it happen. I can tell you in Anthropology of Islam what people do is they go to people who are standing outside the mosque and not praying, and they ask them, so how do you feel about not praying? Why don't you pray? How often do you pray? For me, that's a methodological flaw. You can't ask someone, yes, there is an ideal. Yes, there's a discursive tradition, but the way that it's playing out in life is this varied field of is an emerging field of individuals, of various kinds of things happening. So what happens with the ambivalent argument is that they go with the questions of certainty. They arrive with questions of certainty, and then they observe ambivalence. Another example is this very fascinating tradition or practice in Egypt. When they celebrate the Prophet's birthday, they have these dance parties in the streets, techno music, mixed in with Sufi lyrics, massive speakers, basically dance parties. People are drinking, and there's hashish and all kinds of stuff. And this guy, Samoni Shilka, writes about it, and he mentioned it somewhere, but one of his followers, like people who follow his approach, they basically write about this stuff. Now, what this woman, for example, does is she asks the guy who makes the music, so how do you feel about the halal status of your, is it halal? Is it allowed to do? Because there is critique in society that is basically saying that this entire dancing and music for the Prophet's birthday is like bizarre, right? So she goes there with their position. So you stand in the position of the modernist, of the Salafi reformer, who I think stands in this tradition here for the modernist, with the modernist ideas of certainty, of categories being fixed. And then you ask that guy who's basically clearly doing something else, how do you feel about that? And he is obliged to answer you in those terms. And that is how it is discussed in the tradition of Islam. So my argument is quite specific, that you cannot, and I have more stuff on why I make that argument. So it's specific to that, but I also think, yeah, it's specific to the tradition in terms of the way that people live and the way they think about it, and also niyyat, the way it enters. But that's why when I was reading Wittgenstein, I saw, hey, wait a minute, he's also got this idea. You're making up the rules as you're going along, but you're still maintaining that it's the same game. You are not necessarily maintaining that you're out of the game, or maybe I'm making the game, or maybe I stepped over the line. No. You are still maintaining it. And that observation is a very powerful observation, I think, which basically allows us to move both beyond certainty and fixity of category, but also beyond this recourse to ambivalence as a solution, the theory and the solution for everything. Because then we'll all be writing the same thing. And specifically because they're not ambivalent. This is a narrative. I'm reading the narratives. She made the decision, she made the judgment to drink that coffee. Ambivalence for me would mean that every sip of that coffee would be producing some kind of instability of the self. Because you are basically, by saying that this thing is impure, this impurity, and maybe now this discussion and disgust need to be brought in, but those are how the arguments go. And you can have examples of this where people do react in disgust, in this kind of breakdown, when they encounter the impure, whether it's eating pork, whether it's alcohol, whether it's so it's not unheard of for people to actually have that. But here is an ethical judgment. And based on the pre-certification practice of halal and the intrinsically halal nature of coffee enables someone to actually have a very stable subjectivity in eating that coffee. I come after the fact and then I ask them about their experience and their reflecting. And so that's why I'm using a narrative analysis. And so contradiction, that's why I use that example. I open the paper with that example because that's the example that the ambivalence people would basically use perfectly to say, you see, this is ambivalence. And so I decided to open the paper with that and try and convince people that I'm saying it's not ambivalence. So let's see if it works. And finally, yeah, the certification. So, the circulation of certificates is what got me to this thing. The use of the Wittgensteinian language game and the openness of the game, which I think people have underemphasized. The return to looking more at his work, because he was originally taught always like a relativist. Language games pass each other. Talala side definitely uses that kind of way of using a language game. The language game of Islam, the language game of the West, and these are like. But there are resources there in his work where he actually is not doing that. His critique of exact and inexact, his question of the game and making up the rule. I mean, it's clearly there. It's basically saying this question is. So the thing is not. I try to use him to say that things are always changing, right? The meanings are not what you think they mean as a researcher, firstly, and you have to basically study the context. Again, language use kind of approach. And in doing that, it was a circulation of certificates, right? Both the way in which people make recourse to Muslim trade, to trust all the certificates, even though they know there's all the stuff going underneath, right? They know that there's differences, but they can make recourse to that. but also the way in which, in which conflicts happen, right? So a closed analysis should therefore mean that one halal certificate is purely exchangeable for another. They're just documentary piece of paper that circulates around the world. What actually happens is that you have breakdowns and you have these crises and controversies, where suddenly somebody finds out that actually the Brazilians accept the book of accept the food of the Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book. Right? They are producing halal certificates and sending it all over the world. One of the main exporters is Saudi Arabia. So you going into Mecca, the holy place, and you're eating chicken produced in Brazil, slaughtered by non-Muslims. It's halal according to the certificate. People find out this stuff, and they found out in the last few years. And so now that causes a kind of a breakdown, and so you have new kinds of developments emerging. So that's when that's when differences come in, you know. But then the other part of that is when they actually is in places like India. What I found was like the certificate is really just a veneer for a whole lot of complexity. I mean, here it is true, of course, because of the fact that we have different organizations, the idea of certification, and you have the complexity that sits below and the debates and stuff. But in India, what you sometimes have is literally some guy just coming from a small factory. They don't have nothing to do with it. I mean, I saw the guys what they do. They're slaughtering chicken every day, hundreds of chickens every day. But to supply the hotels are now demanding halal certification in Bombay. A new development, maybe 10 years. Or what do you call that? Medical tourism. So now what the guys do, the same producer, they are still supplying 5-star hotel. But what he does is now got a middleman. He's not happy about it. He's like, I can supply directly. But now there's a middleman, there's a new kind of agent that comes in the middle of him, comes every day, collects the chickens from him, takes them to his premises, washes them, puts them in nice packaging with the halal certificate, he's certified, sends it to Hilton, Hyatt, all these 5-star hotels which are catering to a global audience. And that's one aspect of how it works. I mean, it works in many different ways. But so that's one way you just bypass it. And then the other thing that happens is actually everybody just makes their own certificate. So like here I'm saying there are more organizations. I focus on these 4 and the 5th one become prominent. But there are 1 or 2 other guys around who basically they just make the certificate. They small little individual Maulana, an Imam, he says, okay, I'll make my certificate. As long as people are trusting him or for whatever reason, but also in India this is very, very common, especially for export. So it's from some small area inland in some village, and some Maulana there is giving his certificate. And then the guys in the big cities who are dealing with this, the big organizations say, okay, fine, we got it, and they put their certificate on it. So you don't create this kind of idea of security. And then sometimes they expire. That's the best part. The certificate is only due for it lasts for 1 year. So that's another moment that these things. Well, you have to pay fees for the certificate. So they give you the certificate for the year, and then you have an endpoint on your certificate. When your certificate date lapses, even though nothing has changed in your thing, you are technically now not allowed. And so then there's a whole lot of communication that go out to say these people have not renewed their certificate. Anyway.
So what would be the process? What would be the process of them getting a new certificate or being recertified? Do they come in to a whole spot check again, or do they just issue a certificate?
No, I don't know. Maybe they make you do the thing. I don't know the technical how they do that. Okay. So clear up the whole.
Yeah, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I've heard some of it before, but it goes so deep and there's so many layers of it. So even though I thought I understood what your work was, I can see the depth of it and without richness of this understanding. So thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at the next.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
The next one is a book launched by Jackie Cilliers called Fate of the Nation, 3 Scenarios for South Africa. Next week, it's the final installment of our seminar series. We're collaborating with the English department, so it's going to be in the Yellow Molteno room on the 5th floor, room 579.
For the venue.
Yes, the English department. They said they love book launches.
Oh,
so,
okay.
yes.
Hello.